You have chosen to spend an hour exploring Adventure Time lore to sleep to, and you have made the perfect choice for drifting into peaceful rest tonight. As you settle in and let the day fade away, we are going to journey through the colorful yet surprisingly deep world of Oo, a land built on the ruins of our own world, where magic and science blend together in ways both wonderful and heartbreaking. This is told gently and calmly to guide you towards sleep. The land of Oo was not always the bright and magical place we know from the adventures of Finn and Jake. Long before candy people walked and talked, before princesses ruled kingdoms of sweets, before magical dogs stretched and shaped their bodies at will, there was a world much like our own. It was a world of cities and cars, of technology and human civilization spanning the entire globe. Billions of people lived their lives, built their societies, and never imagined that everything they knew would end in fire and transformation. The event that changed everything forever was called the Great Mushroom War, a name that captured both the nuclear nature of the catastrophe and the distinctive mushroom clouds that rose when atomic weapons detonated across the planet. This was not a war that lasted years with clear sides and slowly building tension. The Great Mushroom War happened quickly, the final exchange of weapons taking perhaps minutes to unleash destruction that would reshape the world for thousands of years to come. The causes of the war were complex and built up over time, international tensions reaching a breaking point that diplomacy could not resolve. Nations possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization, and the delicate balance that kept those weapons unused eventually failed. Perhaps it was an accident, a miscommunication, or a deliberate choice by leaders who believed they had no other option. The specific trigger hardly mattered once the first missile launched, because the response was automatic and overwhelming. Nuclear weapons struck cities across every continent, each detonation releasing energy equivalent to millions of tons of conventional explosives. The immediate deaths numbered in the billions. People vaporized instantly or killed by the blast waves and fires that followed. But the immediate destruction was only the beginning of humanity's end. The nuclear winter that followed blocked out the sun with ash and smoke, temperatures plummeting and crops failing worldwide. Radiation poisoned the land and water, making survival impossible in most places. Yet the Great Mushroom War was not purely a nuclear conflict. Magic, which had been absent or hidden from the world for centuries, returned during the chaos of the apocalypse. Some theories suggested the massive release of destructive energy tore holes in reality itself, allowing magical forces to flood back into a world that had forgotten them. Others believed the desperation of the dying world called out to cosmic forces that responded by changing the fundamental rules of existence. Whatever the cause, magic mixed with radiation and technology in the ruins, creating something entirely new. The crater that would become the land of Oo was formed by one of the most powerful bombs dropped during the war, a weapon of such magnitude that it created a massive depression in the Earth's surface. The crater filled partially with water, forming what would later be called the grasslands and the surrounding territories. The bomb that created this crater may have been special in ways beyond its explosive power, perhaps incorporating experimental technology or accidentally striking a location where magical energies were concentrated. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the crater was a hellish landscape of fire and destruction, everything within hundreds of miles reduced to ash and rubble. Radiation levels would have been lethal to any normal life, the very atoms of the soil and rock twisted by the nuclear energies. Yet somehow life persisted. Survivors huddled in bunkers and shelters, using whatever protection they could find against the deadly environment outside. These survivors would become the seeds of new civilizations that would emerge centuries later. The transformation of the crater into the land of Oo took place over hundreds and then thousands of years. The radiation slowly decayed to safer levels, though it never completely disappeared, and would influence the evolution of life in strange ways. The magic that had returned to the world began shaping reality in ways that defied scientific explanation, creating pockets of impossibility where the normal rules did not apply. Rain fell and washed away ash. Plants somehow found ways to grow again, and slowly, very slowly, the dead zone began to live once more. The mutation caused by radiation and magic working together transformed whatever life survived the initial destruction. Animals changed in fundamental ways, developing intelligence and abilities that evolution alone could never produce. Plants became conscious in some cases, or developed properties that seemed impossible by pre-war biology. The very elements themselves seemed altered, ice and fire and candy and slime taking on properties that suggested they were alive, or at least aware in ways elements should not be. Humans were hit particularly hard by the Great Mushroom War. Their population reduced from billions to perhaps thousands or even hundreds worldwide. The survivors faced impossible odds, struggling to find food and water and shelter in a world that had become hostile to human life. Most of the human survivors eventually died from radiation sickness, starvation, violence, or simple despair at the magnitude of what had been lost. By the time the land of OOO began to take its recognizable form, humans were effectively extinct except for a tiny handful of individuals scattered across the changed world. One of those survivors was a man named Simon Petrikov, though he would not survive as himself for much longer. Before the war, Simon had been an antiquarian and researcher, someone who studied ancient artifacts and historical mysteries. He was a gentle man, intellectual and kind, the sort of person who loved learning for its own sake and found joy in discovering lost knowledge. He had a career that brought him satisfaction, and a fiancée named Betty whom he loved deeply. His life was ordinary in the best way, filled with simple happiness and promising future. Simon's specialty was artifacts of mysterious origin, objects that seemed to have no clear place in the historical record. He traveled the world examining these items, documenting them, and trying to understand their purposes and origins. Most of these artifacts turn out to have mundane explanations, interesting but not supernatural. However, one particular item that came into Simon's possession was different in ways he could never have anticipated. During a research trip to Scandinavia, Simon discovered an ancient crown stored in a forgotten collection of Nordic antiquities. The crown was ornate and beautiful, crafted from gold or something that resembled gold, set with rubies or something that resembled rubies. But the most distinctive feature of the crown were the 3 points that rose from its band, giving it a shape that was both simple and somehow disturbing. The crown radiated a presence that Simon could feel even before touching it, something that drew him toward it while simultaneously making him uneasy. The documentation that came with the crown was fragmentary and strange, references to ice and power and madness that seemed more like mythology than history. Simon, being a careful researcher, noted all of this in his records but assumed the legends around the crown were exaggerations or misunderstandings. He purchased the crown legally and brought it back to his home, intending to study it thoroughly and document it properly for academic purposes. Simon made his first terrible mistake when he decided to try on the crown, treating it as an experiment rather than recognizing the warnings in the old text should be taken seriously. The moment the crown touched his head, he felt its power surge through him, cold and ancient and hungry. His eyes began glowing blue, and ice spread from his hands, freezing everything he touched. The power was intoxicating and terrifying, abilities beyond human comprehension suddenly available to him. He removed the crown quickly, horrified by what had happened and frightened by how good it had felt to wield such power. Simon documented the incident carefully, noting the physical effects and the psychological pull he felt to put the crown back on. He tried to study the crown safely, examining it without wearing it, attempting to understand what it was and how it worked. But the crown was not a passive object waiting to be understood. It was actively trying to be worn, calling to Simon in ways that bypassed his rational mind. Betty, his fiancée, noticed changes in Simon even when he was not wearing the crown. He became preoccupied with it, spending hours staring at it, talking about the power it contained. She urged him to get rid of it, to sell it or donate it to a museum or simply throw it away. But Simon resisted, insisting that something so powerful and mysterious needed to be understood, that destroying or abandoning it would be irresponsible when it could be studied and documented. The Great Mushroom War began while Simon still possessed the crown, the bombs falling and civilization ending in the span of hours. Simon and Betty were together when the emergency broadcast started, when the warnings came that nuclear weapons were inbound and that there was nowhere to run. They held each other as the world ended around them. The explosions visible in the distance, the ground shaking from impacts that were destroying everything humanity had built. In the chaos and terror of those final moments, Simon made a choice that would define the rest of his existence. He put on the crown to protect Betty, using its power to create barriers of ice that shielded them from the blast waves and radiation. The crown's magic was strong enough to keep them alive when everyone around them was dying, its power protecting them from forces that should have killed them instantly. But using the crown came at a cost that Simon was beginning to understand too late. Each time Simon wore the crown, it changed him a little more. His memories became fuzzy, his personality shifted, his appearance altered. The crown was not just granting him power, but was replacing him with something else, overriding Simon Petrikov with a creature of ice and madness. He fought against this transformation, removing the crown whenever he could. But in the apocalyptic wasteland that remained the world, he kept needing its power to survive. Betty disappeared during these early days after the war. The circumstances unclear, but the result tragically final. Simon searched for her desperately, using the crown's power to survive in the deadly environment while calling her name. He never found her, and the loss of Betty on top of losing the entire world pushed Simon deeper into despair. His grip on his humanity was slipping, the crown taking more of him each time he wore it. But he could not survive without it in the hostile wasteland. It was during this period of wandering the ruins that Simon encountered a young girl named Marceline. She was perhaps 5 or 6 years old, a child alone in the apocalypse, frightened and hungry and desperate. How she had survived this long was unclear, but she was alive and needed help. Simon, even as he was losing himself, still retained enough of his humanity to care about a child suffering. He began protecting her, using the crown's power to find food and shelter and keep the dangers of the wasteland away from her. The relationship that developed between Simon and young Marceline was one of the most important in either of their lives, a bond formed in the worst circumstances imaginable, but genuine and loving despite the horror surrounding them. Simon became the closest thing to a parent that Marceline had in this new world, caring for her as best he could even as his mind was slipping away. She called him Simon, and for a while, he could still respond to that name and remember who he had been. They traveled together through the ruins, Simon searching for other survivors and for places that might be safe enough to stay. He sang songs to Marceline to keep her spirits up, silly songs about food and adventure that made her smile despite their dire circumstances. He found her a stuffed animal, a toy he named Hambo, that became her most treasured possession. These small acts of care and kindness were what remained of Simon Petrikov, as the crown consumed more of his identity. But Simon's transformation was accelerating. The periods when he recognized Marceline or understood where he was becoming shorter and less frequent. He would put on the crown to protect her from danger and then forget to take it off, spending hours or days lost in the icy madness before someone or something reminded him. His appearance was changing too, his skin turning blue, his nose becoming pointed, his body warping to match the creature he was becoming. Marceline was too young to fully understand what was happening to Simon, seeing only that her protector was changing and becoming frightening. He would call her by wrong names, would forget their conversations, would act strangely in ways that scared her even though he never hurt her. The man who had saved her was disappearing, replaced by something else that wore his form and occasionally showed glimpses of who he had been. The final separation between Simon and Marceline was heartbreaking and inevitable. Simon, during one of his last moments of lucidity, understood that he was too far gone to keep caring for her safely. The Ice King that he was becoming might hurt her even though Simon Petrikov never would. He needed to leave her before he lost the last pieces of himself that would prevent him from harming her. So he wrote her a letter explaining everything, apologizing for leaving, begging her to remember that he had loved her even though he would forget loving anyone. He left her in a relatively safe place with supplies to survive, then walked away wearing the crown. Marceline called after him, not understanding why Simon was leaving her alone, but he kept walking. He could not look back, because if he looked back he might stay, and staying meant eventually hurting her. So Simon Petrikov walked into the frozen waste he was creating around himself, and the Ice King took his place completely. The Ice King that emerged from Simon's transformation was a tragic figure, a mad sorcerer with vast power over ice and cold, but almost no memory of his former life. He built himself an ice kingdom in the mountains, a palace of frozen water that reflected his cold and isolated existence. He surrounded himself with penguins, creatures he conjured or collected, filling his empty kingdom with simple beings who would not judge him or leave him. The Ice King's madness manifested as an obsession with kidnapping princesses and trying to force them to marry him. He would fly across Ooo on his ice clouds, seeking out any princess he could find, abducting them and bringing them back to his fortress. He wanted desperately to not be alone, to have companionship and love, but his madness prevented him from understanding that kidnapping was not courting and that fear was not attraction. The princesses he captured would escape or be rescued, and he would be confused and hurt by their rejection. Deep within the Ice King's broken mind, fragments of Simon Petrikov remained, buried so deeply that even he did not know they were there. Occasionally these fragments would surface in strange ways, a song he sang without knowing why, a moment of sadness he could not explain, a feeling that he had lost something important but could not remember what. The tragedy of the Ice King was that Simon still existed in there somewhere, unreachable and forgotten, but not quite dead. Marceline survived alone after Simon left her, a child in an apocalyptic wasteland forced to grow up faster than any child should. Her survival was remarkable given her age and the hostile environment, suggesting she had resources and abilities beyond those of a normal human child. Indeed, Marceline was not entirely human, though she may not have understood this yet herself. Her father was not a human man, but was instead a demon, a powerful entity from another dimension. Hunson Abadir, Marceline's father, was a lord of the Nightosphere, a dimension of chaos and evil that existed parallel to the normal world. He was an immensely powerful being, a demon of the highest order, capable of consuming souls and wielding abilities that defied comprehension. His relationship with Marceline's human mother was unusual to say the least, the circumstances of their meeting and romance unknown, but resulting in a child who was half demon and half human. Marceline's hybrid nature gave her abilities that would emerge as she grew, powers inherited from her demonic father that would help her survive in the post-war world. She had enhanced strength and resilience, healing faster than humans and being harder to kill. She could levitate and fly, defying gravity through will and demonic heritage. Most significantly, she had a lifespan that would stretch across centuries or perhaps millennia, aging incredibly slowly and potentially being immortal or near immortal. Her relationship with her father was complicated and painful, marked by abandonment and insufficient expressions of love. Hunson Abadir was not intentionally cruel, but was fundamentally incapable of parenting in ways that met a child's emotional needs. He was a demon, operating by demon logic and demon values, unable to understand what his daughter needed from him. He would appear occasionally in her life, visit briefly, and then leave again, always treating their relationship as casual when for Marceline it was desperately important. The hurt caused by her father's emotional unavailability would shape Marceline's personality and relationships for centuries. She learned not to expect people to stay, to build walls around her heart, to act like she did not need anyone, because needing people meant being hurt when they left. The abandonment by Simon, even though she would eventually understand he had not chosen to leave, compounded the wounds her father had created. Marceline was a child who lost everyone, and she hardened herself to prevent losing anyone else from hurting so much. As Marceline grew older in the decades following the war, she wandered the changing landscape, watching as the land of Oo began to take shape from ruins. She saw the emergence of new civilizations, the Candy people being created, the various kingdoms forming and establishing their territories. She remained apart from these developments, not quite fitting in anywhere, neither fully human nor fully demon, neither child nor adult, but something in between for far longer than humans normally experience that state. At some point during her long life, Marceline was transformed into a vampire, though the exact circumstances varied in different tellings and may have been more complex than a simple attack. Vampires existed in Oo, creatures of the night with powers over blood and darkness, organized into a hierarchy led by ancient and powerful vampire monarchs. Marceline encountered these vampires, and through events that were violent and traumatic, she was turned into one of them. The transformation into a vampire added new powers to those she already possessed from her demon heritage. She gained the ability to shapeshift, transforming parts or all of her body into various forms ranging from monstrous creatures to bats to abstract shapes. She developed a weakness to sunlight, a vulnerability she learned to manage but never eliminate, burning in direct sun, but surviving in shade or under covering. She no longer needed to eat food, but instead sustained herself by consuming the color red from objects, draining the red out of things, and leaving them drained and gray. The vampire hierarchy of Oo was led by the Vampire King and his various lieutenants, each vampire monarch possessing unique abilities and ruling over their own territories. These vampires were dangerous and predatory, treating humans and other creatures as food sources and playthings. Marceline, upon becoming a vampire, existed in this hierarchy initially, learning from them and surviving among them. But she was never comfortable with their cruelty and their treating of others as prey. Eventually, Marceline fought against the vampire monarchs, battling each of them in turn, and absorbing their powers when she defeated them. This hunt took time and careful planning, each vampire possessing different abilities that made them dangerous in different ways. There was a fool who had powerful psychic abilities, the Empress Eyes, whose gaze could petrify victims, the Hierophant, who could manipulate minds and bodies, the Moon, who could transform others into vampires, and the Vampire King himself, the most powerful of all, combining multiple abilities into a nearly unstoppable force. Marceline's campaign against the vampire monarchs was driven partly by self-defense, these creatures threatening her and people she cared about, but also by a desire to prevent them from hurting others. She had spent too much of her life watching people suffer and die, and the vampire monarchs represented threats that would kill indefinitely if not stopped. So she hunted them, using her intelligence and determination and growing powers to overcome each one despite the dangers. When she defeated the Vampire King in their final confrontation, Marceline absorbed all the vampire powers he possessed, making her effectively the most powerful vampire remaining in OOO. But she did not choose to rule over other vampires or to continue their predatory ways. Instead, she remained largely solitary, using her powers to protect rather than prey upon others. She became the Vampire Queen in title, but rejected the cruelty that previous vampire monarchs had embraced. The centuries of Marceline's life between the apocalypse and the time when she would meet Finn and Jake were filled with experiences both wonderful and terrible. She wandered OOO, exploring its territories, meeting its strange inhabitants, and slowly come to terms with what she was and how she wanted to live. She developed her musical abilities, bass guitar becoming her primary form of expression. Using music to process emotion she struggled to articulate otherwise. Her songs were often melancholic, reflecting the losses and loneliness that defined so much of her existence. She lived in various places over the centuries, settling for a time and then moving on when restlessness or circumstances pushed her elsewhere. Eventually, she claimed a cave house as her home, moving in and making her own personal space. The house was dark and cool, perfect for someone who burned in sunlight, filled with the possessions accumulated over centuries. She decorated it with objects that had personal meaning, creating a space that reflected her personality and history. Marceline's relationship with Princess Bubblegum will become one of the most important of her life, though it took centuries to develop fully. They met when the Candy Kingdom was young, Marceline wandering into the territory and encountering the Pink Princess who ruled over the Candy people. Their early interactions were friendly, two immortal beings finding comfort in someone else who would not age and die in what felt like instants. They became close, possibly romantically involved, but eventually had a falling out that created distance between them for many years. The rift between Marceline and Bubblegum seemed to stem from personality differences, and perhaps from Marceline's fear of being abandoned again. Bubblegum was logical and scientific, sometimes cold in her calculations, while Marceline was emotional and intuitive. Bubblegum prioritized her kingdom and her responsibilities, which sometimes meant putting Marceline second, and Marceline could not handle being second when everyone else in her life had also placed her second or abandoned her entirely. They spent centuries apart or barely speaking, both too stubborn and hurt to reach out and repair the friendship that had meant so much to both of them. Marceline wrote songs about the relationship and about Princess Bubblegum, processing her feelings through music because direct conversation felt impossible. Bubblegum threw herself into her work, building her kingdom and advancing her science, using productivity to avoid thinking about emotional matters she did not know how to handle. Princess Bonibel Bubblegum, known to most simply as Princess Bubblegum, was another ancient being who had lived for centuries by the time Finn and Jake knew her. But unlike Marceline, who was born before the war, bubblegum came into existence after it, created rather than born through processes that mix magic and science in ways unique to post-apocalyptic OO. Her origin was tied to a massive deposit of candy biomass that had emerged in the crater, possibly created by mutation of sugar-rich materials mixed with the magical energies transforming everything. The candy that would become the Candy Kingdom started as a massive pool of living, thinking goo, not quite conscious but not quite inert either. This mother gum possessed some form of awareness and the ability to create candy people, shaping them from itself and giving them life and basic intelligence. The candy people were simple initially, childlike in their thinking and dependent on the mother gum for direction and purpose. Princess Bubblegum was created as the first truly intelligent candy person, formed by the mother gum to be its representative and eventually its replacement. She was given human form and human-level intelligence, emerging fully formed and immediately possessing knowledge that would take humans years to learn. But she was also given emotions and the capacity for growth, making her more than just a biological robot, but a true living being with wants and fears and dreams. From her creation, Bubblegum took on the role of protecting and nurturing the candy people, these simple beings who needed guidance to survive in the dangerous land of OO. She established the Candy Kingdom, building its walls and structures, organizing its society, defending it against the many threats that emerged from the weird landscape around them. Her intelligence was remarkable, understanding science and magic both, able to innovate and problem-solve in ways that made her one of OO's greatest minds. Bubblegum's scientific abilities were extraordinary, bordering on what seemed like magic themselves. She could create life, designing new candy people with specific traits and purposes, building them in her laboratory like a surgeon and engineer combined. She understood chemistry and biology and physics at levels that suggested her knowledge came from somewhere beyond just study, perhaps downloaded into her mind during her creation by the mother gum. She was also ruthless when she believed ruthlessness was necessary, making cold calculations about acceptable losses and necessary evils. Bubblegum had created surveillance systems that monitored her citizens, justifying invasion of privacy as necessary for security. She had made weapons and contingency plans for dealing with threats, including plans for how to neutralize people she considered friends if they became dangerous. She ruled her kingdom with genuine care for her people, but also an authoritarian streak that showed in her unwillingness to give up control. The Candy Kingdom itself was a wonder of post-apocalyptic architecture and society, a functioning civilization built from sentient candy and protected by pink walls. The candy people were largely innocent and childlike, needing protection from the dangerous world outside their walls. They loved their princess and trusted her completely, seeing her as both ruler and mother figure. She cared for them deeply. Every decision she made weighted by consideration of how it would affect her people. Various threats had targeted the Candy Kingdom over the centuries, drawn by the presence of so much edible matter in one place or by the kingdom's growing wealth and power. Fire elemental creatures found the candy people particularly vulnerable. Various monsters and villains had attempted to conquer or destroy the kingdom for their own purposes. Bubblegum had defended against all these threats, using science and strategy and sometimes morally questionable methods to ensure her kingdom's survival. Her age was difficult to determine exactly, Bubblegum having existed for at least several centuries and possibly much longer. She aged very slowly or not at all, maintaining the appearance of a young woman despite the long years. Whether this was due to her candy biology or some scientific intervention she had performed on herself was unclear. She had watched the land of OOO change and grow, had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and had survived through intelligence and adaptability. The relationship between Princess Bubblegum and Finn would become important to both of them, though it was complicated by age differences and incompatible feelings. Finn would develop a crush on Bubblegum early in their friendship, seeing her as beautiful and smart and heroic. She cared for him, but as a friend or perhaps as a child, the age gap between them being measured in centuries, making romantic interest from her side impossible. Finn's eventual acceptance of this reality and his movement beyond his crush represented important emotional growth for him. Finn the human was perhaps the most important person in the land of O during his time there, not because he was the most powerful or intelligent, but because he represented something that had become almost extinct: humanity itself. By the time Finn was born, humans had been gone from OOO for so long that many inhabitants thought they were mythical creatures or had never existed at all. Various humanoid species existed, but actual humans were absent, their civilization destroyed, and their survivors having died out centuries before. Finn's origins were mysterious and tragic, beginning with his arrival in OOO as a baby abandoned in the forest. He had been born to humans living outside OOO, possibly on islands far from the continent where the main story took place. His mother and father were part of a surviving human community, people who had maintained their culture and society through the centuries after the war. But circumstances forced them to give up their son, setting him adrift on a raft with the hope that he would find safety somewhere. The raft-carrying baby Finn drifted to OOO, washing up in forest where he was discovered by Jake's parents, Joshua and Margaret. These were not ordinary dogs, but were instead shapeshifters with intelligence and compassion, veterans of many adventures who had settled into running a small detective agency. They found the crying human baby and made a decision that would change multiple lives. They adopted Finn, raising him as their own son alongside Jake, treating him no differently than they would their biological children. Finn grew up believing he was the only human, unaware that others existed far away across the ocean. His adoptive family loved him completely, never making him feel other or less for being a different species than them. Joshua and Margaret taught him values about courage and justice, about standing up for those who could not defend themselves, about being honest and true to your word. These lessons shaped Finn into the hero he would become, giving him moral foundations that guided his actions even in difficult situations. His childhood with Jake created a brotherhood as strong as any biological relationship, the two growing up together and having adventures in the forest around their home. They were inseparable, best friends who understood each other perfectly, complementing each other's personalities and abilities. Jake was older and often served as a combination of brother and mentor, teaching Finn practical skills and offering advice drawn from his own experiences. Jake the dog possessed shape-shifting abilities that allowed him to stretch and morph his body into virtually any form he could imagine. He could become huge or tiny, could form his body into tools and weapons, could squeeze through small spaces or expand to fill large ones. These powers came from his heritage, though the truth of where they originated was complicated and revealed only much later in his life. Joshua and Margaret, Jake's parents and Finn's adoptive parents, had raised multiple children over their years together. Jake was their biological son, born normally from Margaret. But the source of Jake's powers was not genetic inheritance from his parents, but rather from a very unusual encounter that happened before he was born. Margaret had been bitten by a shape-shifting entity, and that entity's essence had merged with her in ways that affected Jake's development in the womb. The creature that bit Margaret was both a shape-shifter and something else, its nature not entirely clear, but its effects obvious. Jake's development was altered by this contamination or infection or gift, depending on how you viewed it. He was born as a regular dog puppy to all appearances, but as he grew, his abilities manifested. He could stretch and reshape himself, and he possessed imagination and intelligence beyond what normal dogs had. The powers were a fundamental part of who Jake was, inseparable from his identity. Jake's brother Jermaine, another biological child of Joshua and Margaret, had no shape-shifting powers, being a normal dog. This difference between brothers sometimes created tension, Jake having abilities that Jermaine lacked, making their relationship slightly complicated. Jermaine was raised with responsibilities that Jake avoided, particularly regarding guarding their father's collection of dangerous artifacts. This created resentment that would take years to address and resolve. The family dynamic in the treehouse that Finn and Jake shared was unusual but loving. Jake had children of his own with Lady Rainicorn, a rainbow-colored flying creature who spoke only Korean. Their children, known as the pups, were hybrids with abilities from both parents, capable of shape-shifting like Jake and fly like their mother. They grew incredibly fast, reaching adolescence within years of birth, a feature of Rainicorn biology that Jake's side did not share. Finn and Jake's adventures began when they were young. Simple quests to help neighbors or explore nearby areas, gradually escalating to major threats that endangered all of OOO. They operated from a sense of heroism and duty, helping people because it was the right thing to do rather than for reward or recognition. Finn particularly embraced the identity of hero, modeling himself on idealized notions of knights and champions from stories, carrying a sword and wearing a distinctive white hat that became his signature. The grass sword Finn acquired during his adventures became a significant element of his story, though its importance was not immediately clear. The sword was created from a grass curse, a living grass blade that bonded with Finn's arm and could be summoned at will. It was powerful and useful, but it was also slowly affecting Finn in ways he did not initially notice, the grass curse having intelligence and intentions of its own. The loss of Finn's arm during one adventure was a traumatic and permanent change, one of the few injuries that did not heal or get magically fixed. His arm was lost protecting someone he cared about, torn off in a moment of violence that showed even heroes could be permanently damaged by their battles. He adapted to having one arm, learning to fight and function differently, eventually receiving a prosthetic that restored some functionality but never quite replaced what was lost. The various prosthetic arms Finn used over time included one made from the grass sword curse, the grass blade transforming into a grass arm that was powerful but dangerous. This grass arm had its own will, and would sometimes act without Finn's conscious control, attacking when he did not intend to or protecting him from threats he had not yet perceived. The grass entity inside him was trying to take over, slowly replacing parts of Finn with grass until it could control him completely. Eventually, the grass curse would separate from Finn entirely, become its own entity called Fern, a grass doppelganger who looked like Finn but was not quite him. Fern possessed Finn's memories but was not Finn, struggling with identity and purpose, sometimes villainous and sometimes heroic depending on which influences were strongest within him. The relationship between Finn and Fern was complicated. Mirrors confronting each other, original and copy trying to understand who they were in relation to the other. The Lich was the greatest threat that Finn and Jake and all of OOO faced repeatedly, an undead sorcerer of incredible power whose only goal was the extinction of all life. The Lich was ancient beyond measure, existing perhaps since before the Great Mushroom War, his origins tied to nuclear weapons and death itself. He was not merely evil, but was the embodiment of evil, death and entropy giving consciousness and malevolent purpose. The Lich had been a normal human once, perhaps, or had been created from humans during the war, transformed by the bombs that killed everything around them. He had become something beyond death, something that could not be killed by normal means because he was already dead, animated by dark magic that should not exist. His appearance was skeletal, his body a corpse that refused to decay, his eyes burning with green fire that showed nothing human remained inside. His power was immense, capable of killing with a word, raising the dead to serve him, and corrupting living things to his will. He was intelligent and patient, willing to wait years or centuries for opportunities to advance his goals. He understood magic at fundamental levels, could cast spells that reshaped reality, and had access to knowledge from before the war that most had lost or forgotten. He was less a person than a force, death reaching out to claim everything living and refusing to be stopped. The Lich's ultimate goal was reaching the center of the multiverse, a place called a time room where he could make a wish on the Prismo that would affect all reality. He wanted to wish for the extinction of all life across all dimensions, ending existence itself, because he believed life was a corruption of the natural state of nothingness. This nihilistic philosophy drove him to commit acts of incredible evil, seeing murder and destruction not as wrong, but as corrections, returning things to how they should be. Finn and Jake fought the Lich multiple times, each encounter nearly killing them, and sometimes ending only through luck or intervention by cosmic forces. They destroyed his body repeatedly, but could not truly kill him, his essence surviving and finding new forms to inhabit. He was trapped at one point, sealed away using ancient magic, but he always eventually found ways to escape or influence events from his prison. The Lich's transformation into Sweet Pea, a reincarnated innocent child version of himself, seemed to offer hope that even ultimate evil could be redeemed or at least neutralized. Sweet Pea was gentle and kind, everything the Lich was not, raised by tree trunks and Mr. Pig in a loving home. But the Lich's essence still existed within Sweet Pea, dormant but not destroyed, waiting for circumstances that might allow it to emerge again. The question of whether Sweet Pea was truly a new being or just a Lich temporarily suppressed remained ambiguous and troubling. The cosmic forces that influenced OOO's history included entities far beyond a comprehension of its inhabitants. Prismo, the Wishmaster, existed in the Time Room, a place outside normal space where he could grant wishes to those who reached him. Prismo was bound by rules about what wishes he could grant, but those rules had loopholes that clever wishmakers could exploit. He was friendly and sociable despite his cosmic power, enjoying company and conversation when visitors arrived. The Cosmic Owl was another entity operating at levels beyond normal understanding, appearing in the dreams of OO's inhabitants. When the Cosmic Owl appeared in your dream, that dream would come true in some form, though the interpretation of the dream and how it manifested could vary. He was not malicious, but his presence marked dreams as prophetic, giving them weight and importance that normal dreams lacked. Death himself existed as an actual being in OO, ruling over the underworld and collecting souls when their time came. He was not evil, just performing his function as the force that ended life and transitioned souls to whatever came after. He could be negotiated with in some cases, was capable of mercy and flexibility, but ultimately fulfilled his role because it was necessary for the functioning of reality itself. The multiverse was vast beyond comprehension, countless dimensions existing parallel to the main OO timeline. Finn and Jake would visit some of these alternate realities, seeing versions of themselves who had made different choices or lived in different circumstances. These parallel dimensions showed how arbitrary certain aspects of their lives were, how easily things could have gone differently if small moments had changed. The elemental forces were fundamental aspects of OO's reality, representing ice, fire, candy, and slime. These elements had existed in various forms throughout OO's history, sometimes as individuals and sometimes as impersonal forces shaping the world. The elementals could become incredibly powerful when they access their full potential, each capable of transforming vast areas of OO to match their element. Patience St. Pim was the ice elemental who existed before Simon found the crown, a human woman who had developed ice powers through different means. She had been frozen for centuries and was awakened in the modern era, confused about how much time had passed. Her ice powers were natural to her rather than derived from an artifact, showing that elemental forces could manifest in individuals without requiring magical objects. Flame Princess was a fire elemental of the current era, a royal from the Fire Kingdom whose powers made her dangerous to those around her. Her emotions were tied to her flames, anger and passion causing her to literally burn hotter and potentially hurt people accidentally. Finn's relationship with Flame Princess was complicated by these dangers, his caring for her and her difficulty controlling her powers, creating situations where she might harm him despite not wanting to. The Candy Elemental was Princess Bubblegum herself, her connection to candy and her ability to create and control candy life marking her as more than just a candy person. She could transform areas into candy when her elemental powers fully manifested, spreading candy matter and converting other materials into sweets. This power was both creative and destructive, making everything unified and sweet, but also erasing the original forms things had taken. Slime Princess represented the slime elemental, a less developed character, but still part of the fundamental forces shaping OO. The slime element was associated with change and adaptation, with formlessness and flexibility. Slime could become anything, could fill any container, had no fixed shape, and thus could take all shapes. When the elementals access their full powers during one crisis, they each transformed their portions of OO completely, creating kingdoms where their elements dominated everything. The Ice Kingdom spread, freezing everything. The Fire Kingdom turned areas into volcanic wastelands. The Candy Kingdom converted matter into sweets. The Slime Kingdom made everything mutable and unstable. Finn and Jake had to navigate these transformed territories and find ways to restore balance before the elemental transformations destroyed OO through their extremity. The comet that appeared periodically in OO skies was another cosmic force influencing events on the ground. The comet was not just a space object, but was somehow alive or conscious, tied to cycles of destruction and rebirth. The comet had appeared at key moments throughout history, including during the time of the dinosaurs and during the Great Mushroom War. It seemed to be connected to Finn specifically, his destiny somehow linked to these cosmic cycles. The revelation that Finn had existed in previous lives, that his soul had been reincarnated multiple times throughout history, added layers to his significance. He had been a butterfly, a comet, a previous hero, each life building toward his current existence. This pattern of reincarnation suggested that certain souls were important to reality's functioning, that Finn specifically had roles to play across multiple lives and eras. The Catalyst comet that was approaching Owo during one period represented both danger and transformation, a cosmic force that would change everything when it arrived. The various factions and individuals in Owo responded to the comet's approach in different ways, some seeing opportunity and others seeing threat. The comet's true nature and purpose were unclear until it arrived, revealing connections to Finn's past lives and the cycles of death and rebirth that structure reality. BMO, the small robot who lived with Finn and Jake, was another character whose origins connected to the pre-war world. BMO had been created by an inventor named Mo, a human who survived into the post-war period and built robots to be his companions and children. BMO was designed to provide entertainment and companionship, capable of playing games, showing movies, and acting as a friend to whoever owned them. BMO's gender was ambiguous or fluid, different characters referring to BMO with different pronouns at different times. BMO seemed unconcerned with gender categories, being a robot and thus not fitting into biological classification systems. BMO's personality was childlike and imaginative, creating elaborate fantasy scenarios and playing different roles within them. BMO's innocence and creativity brought lightness to the treehouse, a contrast to the sometimes dark adventures Finn and Jake experienced. The reveal that BMO would survive far into the future, continuing to exist long after Finn and Jake were gone, was both sad and comforting. BMO would become a chronicler of their adventures, telling stories about Finn and Jake to future generations. In the far future, BMO would be one of the few remaining links to the past, a repository of memory and history for a world that had transformed yet again. The future of OOO, shown in glimpses throughout the series, revealed that change was constant and inevitable. The Candy Kingdom would fall eventually, Princess Bubblegum's long reign ending through circumstances not fully shown. New civilizations would rise, the world continuing to evolve and transform. The Ice Kingdom would melt, Simon potentially freed from the Crown's curse in some timelines but not in others. Marceline would continue existing in this future, her immortality meaning she would outlive almost everyone she knew. The thought of existing for thousands or millions of years, watching everyone you loved die while you continued, was horrifying in its own way. Marceline's future was one of loneliness punctuated by brief periods of connection, each friendship destined to end while she remained. The relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum was eventually repaired and acknowledged as romantic, the two of them finally admitting their feelings and choosing to be together despite their long separation. This reconciliation was important to both of them, healing old wounds and allowing them to be happy together. Their relationship became one of the emotional cores of the later series, two immortal beings finding comfort and love in each other. The revelation about Simon's fate and the possibility of his cure was explored in depth as the series progressed. Magic was established to be powerful but unpredictable, capable of causing the Crown's curse, but also possibly capable of breaking it. Various attempts to free Simon from the Ice King's madness were made, some partially successful, but none providing permanent solution initially. Betty's return from the past through time travel complications added another layer to Simon's story. She had been pulled forward in time at the moment the war began, arriving in modern OOO and finding that Simon had become the Ice King. Her dedication to curing him became her driving purpose, Betty sacrificing her own well-being and eventually her own existence in attempts to free Simon from the Crown. Betty's transformation into Magic Betty, and eventually into something beyond human, showed how far she was willing to go for Simon. She studied magic obsessively, mastered spells that no one else could perform, and eventually fused with a cosmic entity to gain the power necessary to cure Simon. But this cure came at the cost of Betty herself, her sacrifice meaning that even if Simon was freed, he would be free in a world where Betty no longer existed in any form he could reach. The Crown's curse was revealed to be more complex than simple madness. The Crown contained the essence of a previous wearer, an entity named Gunter, who had been a being of ice and winter from the distant past. When Simon wore the Crown, Gunter's personality and desires began overriding his own, replacing Simon with an echo of Gunter's wants and thoughts. The Ice King's obsession with kidnapping princesses came from Gunnar's ancient memories and desires, not from anything Simon had wanted. The removal of the crown from Simon in some timelines showed who he was without its influence, revealing the kind, intelligent man he had been before. But this removal came with costs, Simon being physically and mentally damaged by the centuries of wearing the crown. His memories were fragmented. He was aged rapidly once the crown's preserving influence was removed, and he struggled to reconnect with a world that had changed beyond recognition during his time as the Ice King. Marceline's reunion with Simon, seeing him as himself again after centuries of him being lost to the crown's madness, was emotional and bittersweet. She got back the man who had saved her as a child, but he was changed by time and trauma, and the world they now inhabited was nothing like the one where they had known each other. The relationship they had once had as protector and protected child could not be recreated, both of them being different people now. Jake's eventual fate was hinted at but never fully shown, suggestions that his life would end before Finn's despite them being roughly the same age. Dogs had shorter lifespans than humans, and despite Jake's magical nature, he seemed bound by biological limits in ways Finn was not. The thought of Finn losing Jake, his brother and best friend, was one of the saddest futures the show suggested. But the show also suggested that death was not necessarily the end, that souls continued in some form beyond physical existence. Jake's fate might be to move on to other planes of existence, his consciousness continuing even if his body did not. The afterlife in Adventure Time was portrayed as real and complex, different realms existing for different types of beings, death being a transition rather than an ending. Finn's growth from child to teenager to young adult was one of the primary arcs of the series, showing his maturation and the lessons he learned through his adventures. He made mistakes and learned from them, faced failures and grew stronger through them, dealt with loss and emerged more understanding of life's complexities. The show used Finn's development to explore themes about growing up, about how becoming an adult meant accepting that the world was complicated and that simple heroism was not always enough. The loss of Finn's innocence happened gradually through accumulated experiences. He learned that not every problem could be solved by hitting it with a sword. He discovered that good people could do bad things, and bad people could have understandable motivations. He faced situations where all available choices were flawed, where helping one person meant hurting another. These lessons were painful but necessary for Finn to mature into someone capable of navigating OO's complexity. His relationship with various female characters showed his emotional development, moving from simple crushes based on appearance to more mature understanding of what real relationships required. His crush on Princess Bubblegum was unrequited and eventually outgrown, Finn learning to value her friendship without needing romance. His relationship with Flame Princess was passionate but ultimately unsustainable, teaching him about compatibility and about how caring for someone was not enough if you were fundamentally mismatched. Huntress Wizard became important to Finn as someone who understood his heroic nature, while also maintaining her own independence. Their relationship was complicated by both of them being dedicated to their personal missions, valuing freedom over commitment. This mature acknowledgement that caring about someone did not require traditional relationship structures showed Finn's growth beyond fairy tale notions of romance. The treehouse where Finn and Jake lived was more than just their home. It had been built around an ancient tree that had magical properties, the structure growing and changing over time. The tree's roots extended deep into the ground, connecting to Mother Gum and other mystical systems underlying OO's geography. Living in the treehouse meant being connected to these magical networks, whether Finn and Jake realized it or not. The various rooms and spaces in the treehouse reflected the personalities and interests of its inhabitants. Finn's room was simple and functional, containing his belongings and his bed, but not much decoration or personal touches. Jake's room was more cluttered, filled with treasures from adventures and objects that had caught his interest. BMO had their own space, small and efficient, containing the charging station and storage for games and media. The bathroom was a recurring location for conversations, characters talking while brushing teeth or taking baths, vulnerable moments happening in this private space. The kitchen was where Jake cooked elaborate meals, his skills as a chef being considerable despite his casual attitude. The living room was where the household gathered, where BMO would show movies or play games, where planning for adventures would happen. The surrounding area of the treehouse included Marceline's cave house, located close enough to be easily visited. The proximity of these homes reflected the relationships between the characters, chosen family living near each other to be available when needed. The Candy Kingdom was visible from a treehouse on clear days, its pink walls and towers marking Princess Bubblegum's domain. The Ice Kingdom was far to the north, located in the coldest regions where ice and snow dominated the landscape year-round. The Ice King's castle rose from the frozen wastes, a monument to his loneliness and his ice powers. The castle's interior was cold and empty despite being filled with ice sculptures and penguins, reflecting how the Ice King's attempt to fill his life with companionship were unsuccessful. The Fire Kingdom was underground, accessed through volcanic vents and caves leading down into the earth. The Fire King, Flame Princess's father, ruled there with authoritarian control, keeping his subjects contained and maintaining strict hierarchies. The heat was intense enough to kill most visitors, making a location that few from the surface visited willingly. The Nightosphere, Marceline's father's domain, existed in a separate dimension accessible through magical portals. It was a realm of chaos and evil, demons and monsters inhabiting a place where normal rules did not apply. The Nightosphere operated on different logic than OOO proper, madness and disorder being the natural state rather than the exception. Marceline could travel there, but hated doing so, the realm representing everything about her father that disappointed and hurt her. Lumpy Space Princess was another character who showed the diversity of beings in OOO. A resident of Lumpy Space who had chosen to live in the woods rather than in her home dimension. She was selfish and self-centered, concerned primarily with social status and popularity, but she was also capable of genuine care when circumstances pushed her beyond her usual self-absorption. Her lumpy nature was both her species and her curse, a condition that could be transferred to others through biting. The lumpy space itself was a dimension of floating clouds and purple matter, inhabited entirely by lumpy people who spoke in Valley Girl accents and cared deeply about social hierarchies and drama. It was a parody of certain social behaviors, showing how ridiculous humans could be when obsessed with status and popularity. Lumpy Space Princess had rejected this world while simultaneously embodying many of its values, the contradiction being part of her character. Tree Trunks was an elderly elephant who lived in a small house in the forest, baking pies and having adventures that belied her advanced age and small stature. She was sweet and grandmotherly most of the time, but she also contained multitudes, occasionally showing ruthless determination or unexpected competence in dangerous situations. Her marriage to Mr. Pig and her adoption of Sweet Pea showed her nurturing side, taking on responsibilities that others would have avoided. The Banana Guards who protected the Candy Kingdom were candy people shaped like bananas, possessing minimal intelligence but maximum loyalty to Princess Bubblegum. They were incompetent as security forces, easily fooled or overcome, but they tried their best with the limited capabilities they had. Their consistent failure to properly guard anything was played for comedy, while also showing that Princess Bubblegum valued loyalty over effectiveness in some positions. Peppermint Butler was one of Bubblegum's servants who harbored dark secrets, his innocent appearance hiding his involvement with dark magic and disturbing practices. He could summon demons, had connections to death and the underworld, and generally possessed knowledge and abilities that seemed completely at odds with his role as a butler. Princess Bubblegum apparently knew about his dark side and accepted it, suggesting that she valued his effectiveness more than she worried about his methods. Lady Rainicorn, Jake's girlfriend and eventual wife, represented one of the few stable romantic relationships in the show. She was loyal and loving, her relationship with Jake being genuinely healthy and supportive despite occasional complications. The language barrier between them, she speaking Korean and most others speaking English, never seemed to impede their communication, suggesting that love transcended language in their case. The pups that Lady Rainicorn birthed were a handful, growing rapidly and causing chaos in the relatively brief time before they reached independence. Jake was not always the best father, his laid-back attitude and avoidance of responsibility, creating situations where the pups got into trouble. But he loved them genuinely, and they knew it, the family maintaining connections even after the pups moved out. Magic Man was another complex character, a Martian who had been exiled to OOO and spent his time playing cruel pranks on people. His behavior seemed random and malicious, using his considerable magical powers to cause chaos and suffering for his own amusement. But his backstory revealed tragedy, the loss of his wife having driven him to madness and cruelty. As coping mechanisms for grief he could not process healthily. The revelation that Magic Man was related to Margles, his wife who had died or disappeared, explained his instability but did not excuse his behavior. He was using his pain as justification for hurting others, displacing his suffering onto innocent people rather than processing it properly. Eventually, Magic Man would sacrifice himself to save someone else, using his magic to transfer his sanity into another while taking on their madness himself, an act of redemption that did not erase his previous cruelty, but showed he was still capable of nobility. Normal Man, what Magic Man became after the transfer, was suddenly stable and capable of caring about others again. The experience changed him fundamentally, giving him a chance to rebuild his life and his relationships. He took on the role of a hero, using his powers for good rather than pranks, showing that redemption was possible even after centuries of cruelty. The Mars colony where Magic Man originated was revealed to be a thriving community of Martians who had achieved advanced civilization. Abraham Lincoln was somehow the leader of Mars in OOO's timeline, one of the many absurd elements that the show never explained but simply presented as fact. The Martians had their own culture and magic system, different from OOO's but equally powerful and strange. Glob, Gob, Grob, and Grodd were Martian deities, four-faced entities who represented different aspects of Martian religion. They could fuse into one being with incredible power, capable of fighting cosmic threats directly. Their existence showed that gods were real in OOO's multiverse, beings of immense power who took interest in mortal affairs and occasionally intervened directly. The various dungeon crawls that Finn and Jake undertook revealed that OOO was filled with ancient ruins and structures from before the war. These dungeons contained treasures and monsters, puzzles and traps, operating according to video game logic that everyone in OOO seemed to accept as normal. The dungeons were often connected to the war or to ancient magic predating human civilization, layers of history stacked on top of each other. The revelation that some dungeons were actually tests or training grounds created by beings of immense power added context to their existence. These challenges were designed to identify worthy heroes or to train adventurers in skills they would need for cosmic conflicts. Finn and Jake passing these tests marked them as important to reality's functioning, heroes who would be called upon when existence itself was threatened. The various artifacts scattered across OOO were remnants of different eras and civilizations. Some were pre-war human technology, devices that still functioned despite centuries of neglect. Others were magical items from ages before humanity, objects created by cosmic forces or ancient races that had vanished long ago. Collecting these artifacts was dangerous, but adventurers were drawn to them by the promise of power and discovery. The Enchiridion was one such artifact, a magical book that contained knowledge about heroes and about the structure of reality itself. The book appeared simple, but contained portals to other dimensions and instructions for cosmic rituals. It was sought by many characters for various purposes, its power making it valuable and its knowledge making it dangerous in the wrong hands. The Ice King's own collection of artifacts and technology from before the war showed his unconscious connection to his past as Simon. He had gathered tapes and documents, preserved them without fully understanding why they mattered to him. When he watched the tapes, he would cry without knowing why. Fragments of Simon responded to images and sounds that the Ice King could not consciously process. The reveal of Simon's taped messages to Betty, created when he still fought against the Crown's influence, were heartbreaking glimpses of a man slowly losing himself. He documented his transformation, begging future viewers to remember that he had been a person, that someone named Simon Petrikov had existed before the Ice King. The tapes were evidence and plea, proof of his humanity and desperate attempts to preserve some memory of who he had been. Marceline, watching these tapes and recognizing Simon from her childhood, created one of the show's most emotional moments. She understood for the first time what had happened to the man who saved her, why he had left, and that his abandonment had not been a choice but a tragedy. The forgiveness and understanding that came from this revelation allowed Marceline to process grief she had carried for centuries. The song that Simon sang to Marceline, Cheers, became a theme that repeated throughout the series. Marceline performed her own version, transforming the silly song meant to comfort a frightened child into a melancholy meditation on loss and time. The song connected them across centuries, a bridge between who they had been and who they had become. The various kingdoms and territories beyond the main ones already discussed added depth to OO's geography. The Wildberry Kingdom, the Cloud Kingdom, the Slime Kingdom, and many others existed in different regions, each with their own rulers and cultures. These kingdoms interacted through trade and diplomacy, occasional conflicts arising but most maintaining peaceful coexistence. The politics between kingdoms were handled primarily by the princesses, a diplomatic network of rulers who understood each other's territories and interests. Princess Bubblegum played a central role in this network, her intelligence and age giving her influence beyond just her own kingdom. She manipulated situations to maintain stability, preventing conflicts that could escalate into wars that would devastate OO. The science versus magic dichotomy was explored throughout the series, Princess Bubblegum representing scientific thinking, while characters like Magic Man and the Ice King embodied magical approaches. But the show ultimately suggested these were not truly opposed forces, but rather different aspects of the same reality. Science was structured magic. Magic was science that had not been explained yet. Both were tools for understanding and shaping the world. The technological level in OOO varied dramatically by location and access to pre-war knowledge. Princess Bubblegum had advanced technology, robotics, and genetic engineering that would have been impossible in the old world. The Candy Kingdom had electricity and computers, anachronistic elements alongside medieval aesthetics. Other kingdoms were less developed, operating at roughly medieval or even primitive technology levels. BMO represented the most direct connection to pre-war human technology, a robot designed and built by human hands using human knowledge. BMO's existence proved that some pre-war tech still functioned and that the knowledge to create such technology had not been completely lost. The other MO robots that existed elsewhere in OO showed that BMO was not unique, that Mo had created multiple robots before his death. The reveal that BMO would continue existing for possibly thousands of years into the future made BMO's story one of loneliness and endurance. BMO would outlive everyone, would continue functioning long after all organic life had ended or transformed into something new. In the far future, BMO would tell stories about Finn and Jake to whoever would listen, keeping their memory alive when everything else from their era had vanished. The themes of change and impermanence ran throughout Adventure Time, every episode in some way dealing with how nothing stayed the same forever. Characters grew older, relationships evolved, kingdoms rose and fell. The very landscape transformed under magical and natural forces. The show embraced change as inevitable and necessary, suggesting that trying to prevent change was futile and often harmful. Finn's growth from child to adult happened gradually over the series, his voice physically deepening as his actor aged, his character design showing him growing taller and more mature. The show uses aging to explore how perspectives changed as you grew up, how things that seemed simple as a child became complex as an adult. Finn's heroic idealism was challenged by experiences that showed reality was messier than fairy tale suggested. Jake remained relatively unchanging in some ways, his personality stable even as circumstances changed around him. But he too experienced growth, becoming a father and dealing with the responsibilities that entailed. His laid-back attitude was tested by situations that demanded he care intensely about outcomes, that he put others ahead of his own comfort. Jake learned that being an adult meant accepting duties you did not choose and fulfilling them anyway. Princess Bubblegum's arc involved learning to let go of control, to trust others to handle situations without her direct involvement. Her tendency to micromanage everything in her kingdom was shown to be limiting rather than protective, preventing her people from developing independence and creating vulnerabilities when she was absent. Learning to delegate and to accept that she could not control everything was difficult for someone who had spent centuries being responsible for an entire kingdom's survival. Marceline's journey was about opening herself to connection after centuries of protecting herself from loss. Her walls were thick and carefully maintained, keeping people at a distance where they could not hurt her by leaving. But this protection also prevented the deep connection she craved, leaving her lonely even when surrounded by people. Learning to risk being hurt by loving people was her primary emotional arc. The finale of Adventure Time brought many storylines to conclusions, while leaving others intentionally open-ended. The show suggested that some questions did not need answers, that ambiguity was acceptable and even preferable to neat resolutions. The characters' futures were implied rather than shown completely, allowing viewers to imagine what came next rather than being told explicitly. The final episode brought cosmic threats to bear, while maintaining focus on emotional relationships between characters. The end of the world was significant, but was treated as background to the more important question of how the characters would face it together. The message was that what mattered was not the magnitude of events, but how you treated the people you cared about when facing those events. The implication that Finn and Jake's adventures would continue, that the show's ending was not the end of their story, but just the end of what we were being shown, provided comfort. Their friendship would endure. Their heroism would persist. They would keep helping people and going on adventures beyond the final frame. The story continued somewhere, always, in the endless possibilities of the land of Ooo. As we approach rest, we can reflect on what Adventure Time taught about growing up, about change, about loss and love, and the enduring power of friendship. The land of Ooo was built on the ruins of our world, but created something beautiful from that destruction, showing that endings could become beginnings if viewed correctly. Every adventure there reminded us that even in dark times, even after apocalypse, life found ways to continue, and people found reasons to care about each other. The colorful landscape of Ooo stretched out infinitely in imagination, every region containing wonders and dangers, every kingdom populated by strange and wonderful beings. Finn and Jake walked through this land as heroes, helping whoever needed help, fighting whatever needed fighting, being exactly who they chose to be in every moment. Sleep comes gently now, carrying us away from the land of Ooo, but leaving us with its lessons and its comfort. The world is vast and strange, full of magic and science blended together in ways we barely understand. But within that vastness, small acts of kindness matter. Friendships endure through change, and heroes rise not because they are special, but because they choose to help when help is needed. Good night to Finn the human and Jake the dog, brothers on eternal adventures. Good night to Princess Bubblegum, protecting her kingdom with science and love. Good night to Marceline the vampire queen, ancient and young, forever carrying the past while reaching toward the future. Good night to BMO, who will remember them all when everything else has faded. Good night to the Ice King, and to Simon Petrikov, who still exists somewhere in the frozen madness. Good night to all of OOO, mathematical and magical, dark and bright, ending and beginning and continuing forever. Rest now in the knowledge that adventure never truly ends, that change brings new possibilities, that the friends we make and the love we share matter more than the scope of our achievements. Let the land of OOO fade gently from consciousness, its colors softening, its sounds quieting, until only peaceful darkness remains. The treehouse stands quietly in the night, its inhabitants sleeping soundly, ready for tomorrow's adventures, but content in this moment of rest. The stars above OOO shine with the light of distant possibilities, the universe vast and full of mystery. And somewhere in the eternal now, Finn and Jake begin another adventure, their story never ending, because true friendship transcends time and space, and the limits of what we can see and know. Good night.